Welcome, everyone. My name is Radha Ruparal. Very excited to host this People First talk. I see a few new faces here. So for those of you who are not familiar, just to reground ourselves, the People First initiative is a coalition of actors working across sectors with this deep belief that if we want sustainable development, we need to invest in local leadership, and we need to invest in the collective leadership of many people coming together. Now, this series of talks we've been hosting for the last few months, and it's really learning from this community around, well, what is that leadership and how do we develop it? And one of the themes that have come up in past talks is this idea that oftentimes what we need to do is actually tap into and activate the leadership of, what Mauricio says is everyday people, people from within communities themselves who already have the wisdom and solutions to solve their own problems. And so we've heard this theme come up, and I'm really excited about this conversation because we get to hear from some folks who are really living this in their day-to-day work. So with that, I'm going to introduce our guests for today. First, we have with us Mauricio Miller. Mauricio is the founder of a number of initiatives. So the Family Independence Initiative, the Community Independence Initiative, and most recently, this initiative called the Peer-Driven Change Initiative. And he's going to share more about that. But again, underneath all these initiatives is this idea of investing in the agency and leadership that exists within families and communities themselves. So we'll get to hear a little bit more about what's driven him to that and how that work is transpiring. And Mauricio asked to invite a colleague of his, Steve Dobo, who's there with him. And Steve has been trying out some of these peer-driven approaches inspired by Mauricio's work, both in the US and in Africa. And again, really driven by this idea that, when we're working with families who've experienced poverty, we have to trust them to make the decisions, and we have to invest in their own agency and leadership and channel resources towards them. So Steve can share a little bit more about his journey and what he's learned along the way. So with that, I think, why don't we dive straight into the conversation, and it's going to be a bit of a dialogue for the next 20 to 25 minutes or so. And then, like always, we're going to open it up to the group. So yeah, be ready with questions, put them in the chat so we can keep this an organic conversation and hear from all of you. All right. Well, why don't we start with you, Mauricio? Maybe you can just share a little bit about your personal story. And, you've got this deep belief that we need to invest in the agency and leadership of everyday people, but just tell us how that came about. Tell us your personal story and what's driven you to this work.
Sure. No, really, I'm just really happy to be with all of you. I thank Teach for All and your whole collaborative. And nice to meet some of you. I've run into many of you before. For me, this journey started probably in Mexico and then in San Jose, California, where I was raised, a single mom, and kind of observing my mother and my older sister and then our friends and neighbors, and trying to improve their lot and trying to improve the community, and that there weren't really programs or initiatives they could relate to, and so it was really up to them. And I remember that really, really clearly. So for me, then it was that my mother immigrated to the US when I was about 9 years old or something like that. And things did not go well with our family. And my sister ended up pregnant at 16. And really, my mother was very stressed, and it was difficult to meet, all our bills at the end of the month. But when she saw that my sister's life was really turning bad in America, that she sort of pointed her finger at me and says, okay, Mauricio, this can't happen anymore. She says, you have to go to college and you have to make sure it doesn't happen. And so then I was the quiet kid in the family, and it's like, oh shit, so I'm left with this kind of responsibility. And, in many ways, then I really am the only one in my family that has, quote, made it in terms of the American dream. My sister's life, her kids' lives, all that. There was drugs, there was abuse, there was all of this other stuff going on. And ultimately, I lost my mother. And so I joined the nonprofit sector in the late 70s. Probably a lot of you weren't born, but so I joined the nonprofit sector sort of to deal with this challenge my mother left me, that I was not supposed to let what was happening or had happened to my family happen to others. And at that point in time, all the nonprofits were kind of developing, and I joined a new nonprofit, and I became the ED, the CEO, within a couple years. And so we ran social services. I had, by the end of it, the 20 years, I had 120 staff. I had 5 divisions, and we did housing, we did urban planning, we did training, we did, GED stuff. We started 2 businesses. So I kept adding things because I knew that life for any family was incorporated all these things. And I kind of didn't like the fact that the funders and whatever siloed our lives, as if they just worked on housing, all of a sudden everything would be okay. If they just did economic development, everything would be okay. And so I just kept adding things, thinking I could bring them together. And I would try to bring them together, and that wasn't working. So by the end of that 20 years thing, I already knew that we were considered one of the best in the country. But I wouldn't bring my own family, my nephew and nieces and whatever through my services. Now that I was middle income, I knew there was a bias that was set up within the social service sector that I didn't face when I was middle income, when I could afford to buy things, that system actually worked better. And it was kind of a secondary and unequal structure that was being set up of programs that I wouldn't bring my own family through. So by the end of the 90s, I was very discouraged by that whole approach. But I didn't know what to do because that's all there was, right? And so in 99, I got invited by President Clinton to the State of the Union address to honor my work. At that point, I didn't believe in my work. Actually, originally turned him down, but I went. Anyway, so what ended up happening is about 9 months after the State of the Union address that I got a call from Jerry Brown, who at that point was mayor of Oakland. He became governor of California and ran for president a couple of times. He basically said what changed my life. He said, at that point in time, there'd been 30 years of heavy social sector government programs and whatever. He said, so, and he's addressing me as part of the big social sector, you guys have not fundamentally changed anything. Now, he was in government, but it was like, you guys haven't changed anything. You're a bunch of poverty pimps. In other words, basically that we were making a living from the fact that people were poor. And I had heard that first from the Black Panthers in the 1960s, that the whole war on poverty programs were really going to create jobs for all the graduate students coming out of UC Berkeley rather than the Black Panthers that were also in Berkeley. So, for me, I agreed with him because by that time I told you I was discouraged. So then he said, so look if you could do anything you wanted to do, and regulations and money were no problem, because as a nonprofit, I complained I never had enough money. So he said, if that wasn't a problem and you wanted to bring about some fundamental change, what would you do? And you come to my office next month and tell me. And this is the first time that somebody told me, what if there is no box? Because we are all boxed in. There's eligibility criteria, funder requirements, government, our different communities. And here's this guy saying I could do anything. And so if you imagine that as the challenge I give you, then I thought about everything I knew, including growing up poor, and that I came to the conclusion I didn't know, but I had an appointment to tell him, right? And so at the appointment, he asked me what I would do, and I told him I didn't know what to do, but I knew that my mother figured out what to do to get me out, right? And when she really focused, after my sister got in trouble, it was like, no, this is not going to happen again. So I told him my mother figured out how to get us out. And I think most mothers, fathers, guardians would have a better idea of how to get their people out of poverty or their family and improve their community than we do. And so what I'm willing to do is my mother forced me to be an engineer. I was a bad engineer, but I like data. So I told the mayor, I would like your support to give a diversity of families from Oakland a computer. And I know data enough I would ask them every month what they do to improve their own lives. And I would keep, there'll be no advisors, no counselors, no training or whatever. Let's see what the capacity is of families to help themselves and each other. I knew the capacity of my mother and our close friends, but I didn't know. I'd been working with about 2,000 families a year in my social services, but I didn't know if they were the same. So I told them, why don't we get a diversity of all that show up and don't show up to programs and find out what their capacity is. And the strange thing that happened was that within 2 years, we enrolled families with their friends. There were a group of African Americans that knew each other, another Salvadorans from refugees from the war in El Salvador, the Myanmar, and whatever. So they came in with their friends, and that was their support system, because my staff was not allowed to give any advice, any training. And I had 4 staff that tried doing that, and I fired them. And it was really interesting. After I fired staff for giving them advice, the families realized that they had to do it themselves. And what we learned is that income started going up, children started doing better in schools. The refugees from El Salvador started buying homes. They influenced each other and learned from one another. And so it is that experience of watching other families. I knew my family, but watching these hundreds of other families taking the initiative when I created a vacuum of leadership. As soon as I pulled my staff out and we waited, and we didn't have to wait long. I can tell you, everybody's like, well, they won't know what to do. Initially, a lot of them don't know as a group what to do, but individually, they've always been thinking of something to do, right? My mother would always try to figure out something. You couldn't pay the bill at the end of the month. It's like, okay, now, is there anything else I can do? So when we created that vacuum of leadership is one of the things, then they start filling it. And as long as I stayed there, and as long as I got the data, and I shared the data with the mayor, I had a congresswoman on a commission, whatever. What happened is it starts shifting the locus of power. What they knew is that we were learning from their experiences. And I would tell them, so, I met with the mayor, I met with the congresswoman and whatever. I showed them what you're doing, and the Salvadorans are buying homes, and the African Americans are starting businesses, and this is what's going on and whatever. And they're listening to us, and I'm over there, yeah. Yes, go do something that works. And, you're going to have to help each other, because my staff is not allowed to help you. So that is basically peer-driven change. And then it became an issue of, well, how do I formalize that whole thing? And that's sort of the phase that we're in. I took it internationally. I talked with Wendy Kopp a couple times. I wanted to take that US experience and see if the same thing would happen in other countries. And we went to Liberia, and it was the same thing. I'm hiring a part-time staff who was my tour guide, and he's just going to collect data from you, and you go do something. And their incomes jumped 300%, over 150% within the first year. Children start doing better in school. It's sort of like this parallel that was happening. And then more recently now, with Bridgespan Help and other people, it's been given a name, and we're trying to create a field called peer-driven change. There's people can really do it. And I'm going to kind of leave it at that. And then maybe Steve can tell you how he got into this whole thing and where it's going.
Yeah, no, that's incredible, Mauricio. And again, like the simple idea of people having the solutions themselves, in some ways it's so intuitive, and yet it's not the way the development sector is built. So I love this idea that you actually purposely created a vacuum of leadership, and that just within moments you saw how people gathered together. Yeah, maybe Steve would love to just hear from you around. So you were inspired by this movement that Mauricio has created. And so, yeah, just tell us about your own journey, how you've been doing this work, what it actually looks like in practice, maybe to bring it to life, but then also like, what have you learned along the way?
Sure thing. Great to be here. I created an organization called Up with Africa in 2018 with the desire to work with refugees, education in the developing world, and conservation of endangered species. And I kind of was trying to figure out what to do. So we took a trip in November 2019 to Uganda and DRC Congo and Rwanda, and just to get to know what it was like on the ground. And what we found is the minute you show up, there's an expectation that I and my team have the expertise and the knowledge and the resources to help the people we met out of their difficulties. And what we saw is they were looking for clues from us to for what to say in order to get us involved with them. So I came out of that just realizing that we had to do a different approach than what I'd done in the US. I've been in the helping field like Mauricio for the last 30 years and started nonprofits and LLCs to do work, but I knew something had to be different. And what I knew is that we wanted to come alongside the people that we were interested in assisting and understand their hopes and their dreams and give them access to the resources that we had. So we were trying to figure out, how do you respectfully get to know communities without them spitting back to us what they think we want to hear.
Yeah.
And so I had been to a luncheon about 4 years ago. I'm from Denver, Colorado. So there was a luncheon by a foundation, and Mauricio had sent some people out from his organization at that time, FII. So I had heard about this approach 3 or 4 years previous, and I knew there was a survey component, and we had started to think we need to do a survey of some kind. So I looked up Mauricio. He was launching CII in Liberia. I jumped on a webinar and then stayed on afterwards and said, hey Mauricio, do you want to talk about partnering in Uganda and DRC Congo? And so that's how we started. So the whole idea was, once you have a community that you want to get involved in, how do you get to know them? So we have surveys like Mauricio talked about, and the way it's set up is we work, what Up With Africa does is work with a local community-based organization. We identify an area that we want to work in. We identified a project liaison that's not a real staff member. It's a part-time position that gives out the surveys, collects the surveys, and assists a little bit with the families. But we look for a lead family member in each of the villages we wanted to be in. We asked if they wanted to be part of this initiative, and then we asked them to find 9 other families that they want to work with, not other direct family members, but 10 other households that they'd want to collaborate with in this initiative. So now you've got 10 groups of 10 each to create 100 households in the initiative. And then we do monthly surveys where we ask about how are they doing with their financial situation. So we're asking about business income, expenses, and profit for each of the income generating each person in the household that's generating income. And we do this. Mauricio's got this big spreadsheet. We're slowly bringing this online to what we call a mutuality platform. But so we ask them for each of the groups to get together regularly and talk about what we call mutuality. And mutuality for Up With Africa is 4 things. It's how are you learning together? How are you helping each other? How are you working together? And then how are you paying it forward to help those that are coming behind you? So we ask those types of questions. We also ask some context questions about schools and roads and community, but we're really tracking the main metric of business income and how that improves. And Mauricio will tell you in Liberia, it's like 50% increases or even higher, right? 200% increases over time in their business income. And we believe that if, and there's a lot of books and information on this, but if subsistence farmers can make a little bit more from their farms, they will take that extra money and they'll make all the right decisions that we from above would be telling them they should make. They make the right decisions around the education of their children if they have the money to do that. And so they do. And we believe that the families are the experts of their own lives. So we keep them in the driver's seat. And then Mauricio, you want to add something?
Well, it was more, Wendy just put up something on the chat, which, so I don't know if you can look in the chat, but she had a really relevant question. And questions are actually easier to explain this thing with. And we just talked about that last night. People have tried to okay, so I did this for basically 20 years in the US, and now we went international, and we're getting similar results as what I told you. And people are taking more control. And Wendy's question was, well, what really is it that creates that agency? And, you know, a big thing is that vacuum. One of them is a vacuum of leadership. They need to change their lives. You know, they want to change their lives. We go in there and we say, you are the ones that actually can change your lives. They know we have access to resources. And so they would like us to just make those available. But because we don't come in with any answer, just create this vacuum of leadership, they then have to figure it out. And I do think that one of the other elements in terms of creating agency is that we only enroll people when they come in with a bunch of their friends. We do not enroll individuals. You say, just get a bunch of your friends. And the reason is when my mother, you know, would go into a new neighborhood, she would make friends, or she would get some of the friends from her church. And those are the people that they brainstorm. You know, oh, there, don't talk to that over there, or do this, or whatever. And that was her support system. It wasn't a social worker, it wasn't whatever. And so for us, when we started in the US and then in Liberia, it's like, you can only enroll if you come in with a group of your friends. And initially, everybody says, okay, that's the eligibility criteria, that's what I want to do. What was fascinating is in Rwanda, that the liaison there started observing that the people had to come in with this group, and they did kind of what we told them to, you know. But he said, you know, what's happened over the next several months is that now, where they used to know each other casually and talk or whatever, all of a sudden they're meeting much more intensely, and they're meeting as peers and as close friends. So there is something about actually creating a stronger bond between the people themselves and their inner reliance, as opposed to relying on my program staff. So there's the vacuum, there's that mutuality that exists within the community. The dilemma is that my family, I'm sorry, almost everything came from my mother and our experience. The dilemma was that when my mother met with her friends in the church and whatever, she didn't get new ideas, new opportunities. And what, you know, we realize is rich people go to conferences in Davos and whatever to meet new people, get new ideas and whatever. There's entire conferences and fairs to network, right? Not with your core group, that's your support system, but with other groups. So the other element is that what we do is, and we tell the families, you're going to be networked to other groups that have new ideas. And then you choose who you want to get ideas from and who you work with. So if you think about it, there is a whole lot of other elements to this thing. The last one being finance. Everybody takes this initiative that I've been doing now for a while, and they try to devolve it into, well, it's because you give them money. So they're UBI and their cash transfers, and you know, and that doesn't do it. If you lead with money, it is not going to go anywhere. The analogy is, you know, that when I was with my mother, there was this homeless guy that was, you know, outside the church every Sunday, and you know, I wanted to give him a quarter, and my mother said no. And my mother, well, because he's Mexican, and you know that he's going to break your pride, you know. Yeah, that's not how Mexicans are. And one day she knew I wanted to give him, so she went and talked to him, and she said, so, you know, we can give you a quarter, we can give you $1. That's not going to change your life. If you want to change your life, you have to go back and reconcile with your friends and make friends and with your family. That the only way people actually improve their lives is when they are together with other people. And so he lectured this poor homeless guy, and, you know, and then I'm listening to this, and obviously it was a lesson for me. So it isn't the money. People want to devolve it into that. And for us, though, I taught at Princeton. I'm sorry, it's a longer story, but I taught at Princeton. And what was fascinating is that, and I saw this in Berkeley too, is that those universities and certain parts of the well-off social networks create an environment that challenges you. They create, you know, a vacuum of leadership. They have support systems of classes, and for Princeton, they don't have a business school. So instead, what they do is they encourage entrepreneurship. And it was sort of like I was working in Liberia at the time. And then what they realized, and I'm teaching my class, and we all start realizing, is that you do need some money at a certain point to try your thing. So they set up a prospect student venture fund. Now, these students knew that if they actually move it further, there's angel investors, seed funders, alumni, they can get money from the sector. But it was nascent at that point, And so essentially there is a role for finance, not one-time injections, but what they were told at Princeton is that if you take this investment from the student fund and you do well, you can now access ongoing funding to grow your business. All of the programs that come in with one injection of money, with the expectation, if we told the Princetons that this is the only money you're going to get and there's no investors in the future, nothing's going to happen. So there is a whole bunch of systemic things that need to happen, and we're looking for partners.
Mauricio and Steve, I love some of these insights, right? This idea that it's around, creating a leadership vacuum, and then it's around fostering kind of relationships and networks within communities, and then also fostering them outside, because oftentimes you don't have exposure. And then finance is, of course, an important part of it, but just one piece of it. I wonder if we can just dig in a little bit more into each of these, and then keep the questions coming in the chat. I'll be bringing some of those up as well. But let's start with that first one around vacuum of leadership. One of the things you said is that requires giving up power, right? That's a mindset shift. And I've spoken to both of you a bit about this. Mauricio, maybe we'll start with you. Like, what does that actually take in practice? What are some of the shifts, and Steve as well? Like, what are the shifts you had to make on your own journey in your own organizations in order for that to happen?
Well, what's interesting is it gets easier once you get this thing going. Okay, so at the very beginning, seriously, I hired people that were trained in social work, and they are trained to encourage, intervene, but they have a power position. And so when I fired staff because they were providing advice, you could just see there was a whole shift in all the communities there. So I made it pretty public. Actually, there was a protest that happened because I fired Roberto, right? He says, no, you can't fire him and whatever. So that's a whole other story. It's a really fascinating story. But anyway, so that was one thing I did at the beginning. What's interesting is after I fired those 4 staff, I've never had to fire staff again. And the reason is that now what we do is when we start a new project, and this happened with Steve, and he can tell you, is we connect the families that have already been involved. So in this particular case, these families already knew I would fire staff, and that it was really reliant on them taking any progress on talking with each other and helping each other. So when I started a project in Boston, basically I had the families from the Bay Area talk to the families in Boston and explain what this was about. And they basically said, yeah, staff's not going to help you. You're going to have to figure it out. You have to get there with your friends and whatever. That peer-to-peer, and that's what's called peer-driven change, that peer-to-peer exchange makes it so much easier. And I have not had to fire anybody since then, because the whole network is set up of the next one goes. So you can tell about, Chris, and he played some role, but now you have other liaisons connecting.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Mauricio, for that. And Steve, I know you've had some insights on your own journey around that and what it means for your own leadership. Can you share a bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. I think the challenge is when you adopt peer-driven change, there's an adjustment in your role. And I think a lot of us got into the helping profession because we like to help people. We were good at helping our friends in high school, and then we kind of migrated to doing this professionally. Well, the role we take as leaders and on the ground people that are helping is different. So it's an adjustment. I'm an idea person, and my self-concept is built around that I have great ideas. Well, with a vacuum of leadership, I need to step back and not do that and allow the families to come up with their own ideas. We don't interject, especially in the first 6 months, interject any ideas from the outside. If they ask, what do you think? Our liaisons will say, well, what do you think? Do you know somebody in your network that could help you solve that problem? So that was an adjustment in my self-concept and how I help. And it's been that way for my staff. I've got an organization called Zero Dropouts in the US, and we're doing a project around post-secondary advising. And we're using peer-driven change for the first time on that. So I'm helping my staff understand what their role is, and it's very different. A lot of times I say, forget everything that you have been taught and you know about helping people, because this is different. And it's learning how to, step back and then step in a different way. The powers with the families, they drive the agenda. It's their ideas, and we support. And if I got a resource that they don't have, they may ask me for that to
Right.
help them get further in where they're going.
Yeah, the peer piece, I remember doing this in Hawaii, and somebody had asked it at some other thing. It's like, there is knowledge that we and our social workers and trainers have that the families don't have. He said, financial training, they don't know what assets and liabilities are and how to handle all of that. And so, I mean, aren't we supposed to provide that? And I said, well, we can. And by that time, I know growing up until I was 30 something, I didn't know what the hell a liability and an asset was. I was an engineer. So it's like, I told him, so because I had money when I needed to learn that, I hired an accountant and he told me, right? But it was when I needed it. And that's the way the system works for us. So the way we do it through social services, we apply that first as if that's what used to happen. And so the situation came up in Hawaii but we need to learn what that is, to better, and these were Native Hawaiians in a group. And I said, okay, that's fine. What they knew is I had money and I had connections. So I said, look, I will pay for the trainer and the facility and the food. If you think it's important, you organize it. If you organize it and find the trainer, I'm willing to pay the expenses, but you have to do the recruitment and bring people there and see if it happens. And so they did that. They organized a financial training, whatever, and we paid for it. And then I was waiting and I asked them, so do other groups want to self-organize to bring in trainers to learn all that? And they said, oh, no. We're just actually teaching each other about what an asset and liability is. Never again in Hawaii was I ever asked to bring in skills training, because they by this time understood it was a peer-to-peer piece. It's true. My mother learned a lot of bookkeeping and ever from a friend, and that's how she got to be a bookkeeping clerk. We make assumptions that aren't right a lot of times, and that's why the vacuum of leadership. We do have resources, and essentially then it would be like, if you have enough money, you're going to hire the accountant when you need them. That's how we get approached now. It's like, we need that. We don't have the money. Actually, we just approached, they need a computer in Kenya and Tanzania. So it's fine. We'll get you a computer. Okay. But you run it. You get the data and whatever.
Yeah.
So
What I love about that,
changes.
what I love about that is it's shifting the power structures. It's being driven by needs, but it also leads to a lot of creativity and probably more resourcefulness with these peer-to-peer networks. There was a question in the chat, and I'm going to encourage everyone to keep putting some questions in the chat, and I'll pause in a moment so you can do that. But there's a question in the chat around data, and the question from Brian: how does data play into the equation? And I'm going to even broaden that a little bit, because one of the things I heard you say is your role has transitioned to be a bit of a learning organization. So sometimes you're seeing things that are happening and then elevating that. So can you just share more around data, but also, how do you see yourselves as elevating the learning that's happening from these communities, and anything more you can share on that?
Yeah, so one of the ways we do is we collect the data. We've in our Ugandan initiative, we fed that back to the families. So once we had a year of monthly data on their business income and expenses and profit, we created graphs, and our liaison brought those back to each of the families so that they could track what they're doing. The other way that we had not thought about is that families were not used to tracking any of that information. So when we asked them for it, we don't expect it. We ask them for it, but we don't expect it that first month looking backward, because they don't do it. And what they came back and said is, we never thought anybody would ask us for this information, so we didn't track it. But then once they started tracking their own data, they have a value, and they asked for copies of their previous surveys so that they could see what they did last month. So that the ask of for the data transformed how they were looking at their own family businesses.
Let me add a little on that, because in talking with Uganda and Liberia, the internet access to the internet and smartphones is just much lower than you would expect. Everybody has cell phones, but they don't have smartphones or computers. And so the issue is how to get them data. But in the US, remember when Jerry Brown supported this, I asked him for enough money to give every family a computer so I could get the data, I could do the surveys online, get the data back. So in the US, and we're doing a project in New York, the system itself gives the participant themselves, they have like a Facebook, you have a Facebook page. So that's what we have in our mutuality platform. We have an online platform. Every individual that has a project can set up a project profile there. And as long as they're giving us data on it, what happens is the system, and the international one isn't there yet, but the US one was, will feed back a line chart that shows here's their trend of how they're doing, in terms of like their income or their savings or their debt. And then what it does is it also gives them a comparison of how they're doing compared to the rest of the city group, the rest of the groups in the city. It was that comparison that drove the most change. That was in the US. They could see then what they would ask, well, what are they doing that, how come I'm not doing as well? And we'll say, well, why don't you go ask them, put something online. And again, like Facebook, you can talk with each other and whatever. It is harder in Uganda and whatever, where they don't have that access. Because there was less in terms of connectivity, what we did is because we plan on getting this to tens of thousands, if not ultimately millions of families to have their own place like Facebook has, that essentially then it was like, can you share a smartphone or a computer? Remember they're organizing in groups of 10. And again, I didn't know, because the US, everybody has one. But over there, it was like we could afford to give each group one smartphone. But they'd have to actually schedule to do the online surveys and whatever and look at their data. And they were sure. But if you lose it, you're going to have to replace it. Sure. And two have lost it. And they then started a group savings to be able to buy that small smartphone. They come up with ways of doing it. If it's worth it, it's for you and I, it's all supply demand. If it's worth it to me, then I'll take the trouble to do it. And so what we're finding is that if we make things convenient for them, if we have access and can react to the resources they need, they will find solutions on it. So I do think that the data works for the families.
That's incredible. Yeah.
That's sort of one of the most basic pieces, is make data work for the families. When I was running social services, the families never saw my data. I shared it with funders. So yes, the data is going to work on the policy side. It has not. I get the most resistance from the policy makers and the program makers and the funders. I have no resistance from the families, right? So, for us, talking to you guys and, Wendy and now the head of social innovation at the World Economic Forum is interested. We need those people with that kind of credibility to say, let's use the data and form our initiatives and policies and aid in a very different way. And that is starting to happen, okay? But I admit, the data has been more useful to the families than how the uptake has been on policy and funding.
Well, that's helpful to see, because oftentimes that doesn't exist. And actually, it leads to Gustavo, your question. Maybe you can just come off mute and just share your question. And yeah, we'll see, Mauricio, if you have any thoughts on this or where you want to go. But yeah, Gustavo, do you mind sharing your question? Because it's quite tied to what we're talking about.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And Mauricio was sort of addressing that already. But this experience, it seems to highlight some of the features that many I've worked in Chile and Mexico, and when you look at the social policy run by central governments, whether at the national or the local level, you often see, the top-down traditional approach. So how would this frame that makes sense for these small groups of social, connections of individuals? How would these guidelines have to transfer to then speak both for the mindset, but also for like the actual way in which these systems are set up politically, but also in terms of operations management and so on.
So it's really difficult. We have a project in Jalisco, and I can tell you, even transferring money there is such a pain in the butt, right? The drug money and whatever. So the rules and regulations over everything. I tried doing it in Singapore. The government got involved. Forget it. We just dropped it. It just was not worth it. You have to know that I'm a little cynical about some things because of my last 20 years in trying to do this and hitting all these walls. The piece that gives me a little bit of hope is that people in power really only react to other people in power. They have that power. They know they can drive what we do. So for us, the fact that the head of social innovation for I don't know if you're the World Economic Forum, but they're the ones that do Davos, and all the billionaires show up and all the heads of state show up. If that organization decides to become interested in and they have, I've seen some of the initiatives that they're now backing, that starts influencing the heads of states and the billionaires, some philanthropists, whatever. So you almost have to start at a peer level with that. If you try to do it from our position of not being in power as nonprofits and whatever, or small funders, it's half impossible. You spend so much time doing it. Anyway, that's a bit of my cynicism. You may be able to do it, from a local area. At some point, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to organize the families to go protest that the money should go to them and they should leave. But we're not quite there yet. Hey, so that's my thought in terms of policy and whatever. We need some bigger players because the data is there. The issue is, will people accept it, at the level that you're talking about?
I would just add one other thing. We work in refugee settlements in Uganda and with UNHCR. And what we try to do is to see if they would give the room to allow us to do a pilot with this alternative approach. So they may be doing all of this work, but it's like, were you willing to carve out some money or allow us to put some funding in to serve this piece of the population? And then we try to get them to compare the results. And that's what we've done in Rwanda there. So sometimes that opens up eyes of like, wow, the other thing is leadership will find that it's more cost effective and it's more sustainable over time, because whereas if you're doing training from an expert side, the result peters off over time. But if you're building the self-organization of people, the lowest point is when you start, and they just go up from there. So it just starts to increase, and it's much more cost effective. We haven't talked about cost here, but compared to building staff, and there was one initiative in Rwanda where they have $31 million over 7 years, and they hired 250 coaches. Well, we're saying, well, they can coach themselves, and you don't have to spend money for 250 coaches. In fact, one of the things when groups got together, we did not say anything about creating savings groups, but all of our groups created their own model of savings groups to help each other. And then we find other organizations that all they do is train people on how to do savings groups. We didn't train any, and they did it.
They heard from each other. Oh, in Liberia, 97% of the families are involved in savings groups, right? Oh, maybe we should consider doing that. And then, well, how do we do it? Go talk to Chris in Liberia, or, Uganda or refugees. And then what he mentioned about UNHCR, this whole approach, peer-driven change is what we're trying to establish, is getting some attention. And they're regional directors with UNHCR. This is not the top level of UNHCR, right? But there's a regional director. So the regional director in Uganda got moved to Ethiopia, where she was having to deal with 600,000 IDPs and refugees. So she was really good. They moved over there because there's a huge problem happening in Ethiopia with Sudanese and the war going up in the north. And what she said is, well, maybe you guys might be interested in bringing your approach to Ethiopia. This, again, it was because at a peer level, she had understood it over there. She brought it over here. That peer piece, whether it's, the head of innovation at the World Economic Forum, whether it's Rita or Tita at the UNHCR level, whether it's the liaisons within these communities, we are going to be having more Zoom calls that are global, or whether it's families. We had families from Liberia do a Zoom call with families from the project in the Philippines, and they loved it. And that's where the saving thing went, is like in Liberia, they had already established that microloans were not going to work. They just get us into more debt. And so they actually, and this was word of mouth before I showed up, is that a whole issue of self-organized savings is the way they should finance their own things. And so it started, and by the time I got there, 90-some% were already involved in some kind of savings group. When the call happened between the Liberian families and the Filipino families, the ones in Liberia start saying, oh, we're doing the savings group and that's helping us finance and do this. And then Mauricio and them can actually invest in some of the things, that we might need. If we have our own money in there, he's willing to consider, matching some of our money. And so he started telling that to the Filipino families. Next thing we knew, there was a huge jump in the savings groups that were being formed in the Philippines. They said, oh, our parents used to do some of that. Maybe we should go back to that. Again, it's that peer piece without having to do training.
Mauricio, it's incredible like that we're hearing there's both peer networks locally, and then I love this, that there's like learning networks globally. Is this happening organically, or are there structures you're putting in place to enable this learning? Like, yeah, tell us how you're structured. I think this is a question that had come up, like, yeah, what are you learning about building these learning networks? How are these connections being made? Is it, organic, or are there things you can do to even fuel that further?
It is both. So I'm much more into understanding the natural, organic expansion. And so the reason we're in Kenya and Tanzania is that a teacher in Tanzania and a doctor of some villages in Kenya heard about this initiative from people that were traveling through their countries that have heard about Liberia. Dr. Stephen Ochingai is there. And I think he talked to somebody from Boston, probably Torley. And so there were people that had traveled, and the story came out. Then Dr. Ochinga then contacted me, and Dixon, who from Tanzania, contacted me and whatever. So there was something organic that was going on there. The thing is, we can also facilitate that. So the meeting between the families in Liberia and the Philippines, we facilitated. And we're talking about having, again, making that an option for families. And then if they're willing to organize it, we will use our connections and whatever to set that up. So the issue is not to then overcome the natural piece. There's a tendency for us to overstructure. Okay, and that's this whole thing. It's like you have to be really careful, because we can say, okay, the model is that from now on, you're going to do this, this, and this. And then the families say, okay, so we'll be on a Zoom call every 3 months because they say we have to be on. So there is a danger in overstructuring, but to provide options for families, like growing up middle class, I want options. Nobody's going to tell me how to do it. So provide choices and stuff. So it's a combination.
And I would say, for the project liaisons, there's a project liaison that's part-time for each initiative. And so they wanted to learn from each other.
Right.
So we decided to bring them together monthly. So the first Thursday of the month, all of the different 6 project liaisons get together and they give updates to each other about what they're doing or any challenges or opportunities that they're seeing. So that's a 1.5-hour call that we facilitate, but they're adding all the content to learn from each other.
Amazing.
There's a question about how you choose the individuals to start.
Yes, yeah, I was going to throw that one out there. Love to hear your thoughts.
That's a really important one. And then the issue I think you're getting is that there's no way we can share everything in a call, just one call. And so there will be follow-ups that we're starting more globally so other people can join and get the same answers to some of these questions. But in terms of starting, it is sort of what I told Jerry Brown when we started in 2001, is that I felt that if it just even in Oakland, that I had families from El Salvador, I had families that were refugees, families that were immigrants, I had families that were had their families had been enslaved, and it was just the diversity of communities, and some of them lived in East Oakland, West Oakland, and different. So I told them, look, I want to understand the capacity of families in a region. And so if you let me enroll one family from West Oakland, one from East Oakland, one from that's a refugee, one that is from some other situation, what I will do is that we already know the diversity that exists in Oakland. I will choose a seed family from each that represents those, and I will then charge them to go self-organize their own group, 5 to 12 or whatever. And so it was that I don't choose the 5 to 10 or 12 families. And the same thing in Uganda is 90% of the families are self-organized. We actually choose and we tell, like, we're going to go to India, I hope. And we basically said, look at, you need to get a representation of the different groups and different networks so that each seed family does not necessarily know each other, because they'll bring in the new ideas. But we don't want to leave them isolated. So we let them self-organize the friends that they know. And that's how you get this diversity. So the initial ones is to get a diversity of opinions. In Boston, we ended up doing that same thing, and then later realized that there were a lot of Haitians from Haiti in Boston, and because of the language, the barriers with the other groups, that we had none there. And so at that point in time, we realized we don't have all the diversity we need. We want to learn from that community. So we found a seed family that was Haitian. They formed a group, and then they started expanding from that. So that's kind of how you find the initial families.
Yeah, that's incredible. And we will share out some resources afterwards around if you want to learn a little bit more and get more deep into this. How do you connect with Mauricio and Steve and the broader initiative? Let me throw one final question in there because I think it's a good one, and we'll do kind of a short answer to wrap up. But this was the question from Ola. I'll just in the spirit of time, just put it out there. But Ola had said, how do you think about growing the leadership within your own organization in order to live into this new way of working? So and Mauricio, you've shared a little bit of advice on that, but yeah, anything else to say, and just maybe any closing thoughts that you'd want to leave us with?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or
Let's
Steve.
see. I'm trying to read it.
You adopt this approach within your organization to grow the leadership of your people and how that works in practice.
Yeah, we've kind of touched on it. So here's the difficulty. We have a project in Romagna, the refugee camp, being sponsored by one of the largest NGOs in the world, AVSI, out of Italy. And they're running $1 million programs, right? And so it's like, well, how do I bring into that? The other provider in that same camp is a youth organization formed by a refugee that really doesn't have any money and whatever. They just youth kind of helping each other. And again, well, then how do you engage that? The difficulty is usually with the most established organizations that we've had to do this with Children International. Essentially, we have to say, you have to start all over, and that's what's really hard. What everybody tries to do is they try to take the programs that they have funded and the logic that they've explained to the funders and make an adjustment and say, this is more people-centered or more like peer-driven change or more like whatever. And giving up power is giving up power. It is not an adjustment. I'll give a little bit of my power up. And so the adjustments don't happen. So what was interesting about ABSI, because they had all these whatever, is that the woman from UNHCR, she actually was over there, well, why don't we try it, right? And UNHCR is powerful enough that AFC said, okay, we'll try this other initiative of which you recruit families that are not involved in our other 3 paths with millions of dollars. And so it happened because the CEO there was willing to do that. With Children International, again, they said, we're experimenting with new ways. Let's try that particular thing. With YON, with the youth project, I'm not really sure why, but it was easy because it was, oh, we can do this. And it's not like I create a lot of jobs for them. It's a part-time job for Ivan, right?
Right.
So I guess the answer is, in many ways, to shift power, you can have the services you have, but to start this, you have to clear a path that enrolls, again, a diversity of families that aren't dependent on your program. In Children International, some do go to their programs, but it was fascinating. We said, if you start and some of your families are enrolled in your programs, then when they self-recruit to organize their families, remember they have to self-recruit friends. You cannot restrict them to only bring in other families that are enrolled in your programs. You have to allow them to bring in families that have nothing to do with your program, because friendships are friendships, right? And they agreed to do that, and that's what works.
So, I would just say one quick thing. We're all successful in what we're doing, but when you look at what you're doing, if you feel like you could do it a little bit better, more cost effectively, and that there's some things missing, like I was not comfortable with this sort of colonization, approach. I didn't want to come in like that. So I was looking for an alternative approach. This is what this is, but it takes some time because it takes some adjustment on everybody in the organization's part. Leadership, especially leadership, looks differently. So a good question would be, what does leadership look like within peer-driven change? There is a role there, but it looks very different than a traditional leadership role.
Well, I think that's a great inquiry question to leave us on. So thank you, Mauricio and Steve, for just daring to imagine a new way forward that shifts power structures and giving us a window into actually how that practically happens, enabling the leadership, believing the leadership of everyday people, creating learning networks that can foster peer-driven change that leads to work that's more sustainable, more cost effective. So it's been such a rich conversation, and I know it's just the beginning of many. And appreciate all the great questions as well. So thanks again. I hate to close off the discussion, but we'll send some summary notes and some ways if you want to connect more with Mauricio and Steve in the initiative. And just a quick sneak preview. Our next People First talk is going to be a slightly different format. It's going to be happening in September at the UN General Assembly. It's going to be a great conversation with Darren Walker of the Ford Foundation, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia, and Anne-Marie Bourgogne of the Emerson Collective. And they're going to be talking about exactly the conversation that we've been having in this community, which is around how do we tap into local leadership for sustainable development? And don't worry, if you're not in New York, it's going to be live streamed. We'll send out some more information about that along with some of the notes from this conversation. So yeah, thanks again, Mauricio and Steve, and for everyone for just participating again today.